Live from the Clarity from Chaos studios, heard worldwide, it's Dave Campbell. On every episode, Dave and his guests explore, discuss, and work on solutions to some of life's biggest challenges. So, if you're ready, be prepared to be enlightened, amused, and even shocked by what you hear. And now, the real, the authentic, the one and only Dave Campbell.
Welcome back to another edition of Clarity from Chaos. In an age of information overload, it is completely apparent why everyone is struggling to find some form of clarity with all the chatter and chaos that's going on. I would like to introduce someone, however, that has spent a lifetime negotiating through that chaos, and that is attorney Leighton Gray, host of the Gray Matter podcast. Hailing from Alberta, Canada, Leighton has a clear understanding of the issues facing Canada and the United States. So welcome to the show, Leighton.
Yeah, it's great to be back on your program.
It's great to have you. So, I might as well start out with the elephant in the room. With the exit of Trudeau, what does Canada's future look like? I mean, are you littered with liberals you can't get rid of, or are you going to be able to bring some level of common sense back into the Canadian government?
Well, that certainly is the question of the day. The first question is, has Justin Trudeau actually resigned? He promised to resign a few weeks ago. Some of us think that was kind of a ruse to convince Donald Trump to sort of forestall the tariffs that he brought into effect and then has put off for another 30 days. But, just today, Justin Trudeau has been very active in the media. He actually said publicly today that during his final days in office, he feels a license to be ruthless. Well, that's pretty scary considering he's the most ruthless political leader we've ever had in this country.
License to be ruthless. That's interesting.
Yes, because he's on his way out. So I guess he thinks he's going to land a few more heavy punches on us on his way out. The sad part about Justin Trudeau, to answer your question, is that the pretender to his throne is someone named Mark Carney, who, if you can believe it, is actually worse. He's as much or more of an ideologue than Trudeau, but actually has a functioning brain. Canada is actually in a situation, it's almost worse than what happened with Kamala Harris, where she became the front runner for the Democratic Party to become president, having never won a primary, having never really won anything. Here we have this guy, Mark Carney, who's never even run for office and apparently is going to be our prime minister. He's privy to state secrets. And the worst part of it is everything that Donald Trump says on the economy, on gender, on DEI, Mark Carney says the opposite. He's even more of an avatar for the World Economic Forum and for globalism than Justin Trudeau ever was. So in sum, the outlook for Canada is very bleak, except for one really important thing, and this is what I'll finish off with. One very important thing. The Americans are taking, and the American government especially, is taking an unprecedented interest in the domestic affairs of Canada. And this is something I think when I was on your program a while ago, I predicted. I said Donald Trump was going to do this because he understands keenly that, like never before, perhaps going back to 1812, Canada actually poses a serious geopolitical threat to the safety and security of the United States. Not because we have a massive army, not because we can hit you with poutine and maple syrup, but because our government is a CCP client state. And Donald Trump and his new administration are keenly aware of this. And I don't think they are going to stop until the face of globalism is wiped off the face of the North American map. And by that, I mean the Liberal Party of Canada. I really see when Donald Trump, and we all know that he deals transactionally, but when he's speaking to Canada, when he's speaking to Justin Trudeau, my sense is he's not speaking to Justin Trudeau, he's actually speaking to Xi Jinping. He's actually speaking to Vladimir Putin because he's playing on the big board, the big game of risk in which Canada, let's face it, is a very, very small player.
Yeah, but the interesting thing is by floating the idea, and I don't know how Canadians view this about Canada becoming the first state. Quite frankly, I think it would be marvelous, Leighton, if there was some kind of loose economic fabric that pulled toward, we weren't talking about tariffs. We weren't talking, say, the north border, but we were actually, coming together from an economic and just a common sense standpoint. Because Alberta is sitting on top of a massive amount of energy,
fourth largest deposits of oil and gas in the world.
Yeah, and it just would make sense, which kind of, and I'll ask this in a little bit later in the program about the Keystone Pipeline, but to me it would just make sense, and I don't know how the Canadians feel about, and maybe not being the 51st state, but becoming much more closely tied. To hell with the Canadian government, because we've suffered through the 8 years of Obama. We suffered through the 8 years of Obama and the 4 years of Biden, and thank God there was a 4-year hiatus in there with Trump. And now we have, basically Trump on steroids, because after the debacle in 20, I think he spent the last 4 years, and I made this comment the other night, putting together a 3-ring binder of all the stuff that he was going to fix, and he's been at it now for 2.5 weeks. And the poor Democrats in our country are going nuts. Their heads are exploding, all over the place. So what do Canadians think about a much more closely tied economic package between Canada and the U.S.? What's their thought?
Well, I can tell you they took a poll last year in Canada, and Donald Trump was much more popular than any political figure in Canada, especially Justin Trudeau, who, I mean, for American viewers, try to imagine if Gavin Newsom had been your president for a decade. That's what Canada has been living through. But, this concept you bring up of manifest destiny, U.S. manifest destiny, is not a new one. It goes all the way back to George Washington. And it's come around in various iterations. Most recently, in 1867, when America acquired Alaska, that was really the impetus for the creation of Canada. The Brits really built a railroad and pushed Canada out to the west coast of Vancouver in order to sort of prevent American expansion. And then, of course, we had 2 world wars, and America got very busy doing a lot of other things, one of which was rebuilding and restabilizing war-torn Europe. But now here, this idea comes around again in a lot of ways, as you quite rightly point out. It makes a great deal of sense. Even if Canada is, let's say, an independent, quote-unquote, independent nation, there's no question that it is in the best interests of Canadians and Americans for Canadians to be allies with America, to have our economic policies aligned. Even our social policies, I think, need to be aligned. I think we're stronger together because, as Donald Trump rightly points out, in some of his tweets, he rightly points out, we have common enemies, and they're big boys like Russia and China, and they want this continent. They want Canada as a prize that China covets. That's why they've infiltrated our government. That's why they've actually fixed our last 2 elections. So I can tell you, as a Canadian, as a keen observer of political events in Canada, there's a great deal of interest and desire to be closer to and even be part of the United States. Canada is sick and tired of the wokeness and the socialist economic policies that we've been suffering through for these many years.
Well, you saw, in this year's, the recent election, that the American public pretty much put their finger in the eye of the Democrats, because
they sure did.
We've had enough. We had enough. There was plenty. We got our noses rubbed in this crap, and even today with Trump, or I guess it was yesterday, Trump signing the No Men and Women's Sports. Well, the NAACP, NCAA. I'm sorry.
Right.
Yeah, the NCAA came out today and said no more men and women's sports. So just that kind of common sense. I can't understand why Canadians, quite frankly, are putting up with that kind of crap from the Canadian government.
Mm-hmm.
I don't get it, other than for the same reason that this country is kind of, we deal with the West Coast and the East Coast kind of liberalism, and then you have all of the flyover country, right? That's all red. I don't know how conservatism is bracketed in Canada.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I can tell you, having experienced MAGA up close, I had the experience of being in Henderson, Nevada, right before the election. I was at a Trump rally. I was in an arena of about 20,000 people. Donald Trump was there. I was in a circle of people, about 250 people, holding hands and praying that Donald Trump would win the election. And everyone there was talking about God, invoking, even Trump himself talks about what happened to him in July in Pennsylvania as a miracle.
Right.
JD Vance talks often about his faith. And that's something that in Canada is missing at this point. I see MAGA as a made in America response to globalism and all the
Yep.
evils of globalism that Trump is now
Yep.
knocking down like so many dominoes. But
Right.
it is a response, I think, that MAGA is an irresistible force and that globalism is a movable object. And this
Yeah.
explains why its tremors are being felt so
Oh,
keenly right here in Canada, because all the stuff that's happening in Canada, which I welcome, by the way, because we need change, would not be happening but for Donald Trump and the MAGA movement. And I have to say, I'm very grateful that Donald Trump is taking such an interest in Canada, and more particularly in the welfare of Canadians, because Donald Trump is, I believe, he's more interested in the well-being of Canadians than our own government is at the moment. And I hearken back to something he said at CPAC in February of 2022, right around the time of the truckers' convoy, when he said if he regained office, he was going to liberate Canada from our authoritarian government, the government of Justin Trudeau. And say what you like about Donald Trump, he almost always does what he says he's going to do.
yeah.
And I believe he has on his agenda essentially the removal of Trudeau. I believe all the tariffs and all that stuff is a means to an end, and that is to get rid of the Liberals, to get some semblance of conservatism, something looking like republicanism in place in Canada, so that we're on song with the Americans and we are a united and allied force against the many enemies that we.
Yeah, I think it would just be marvelous, quite frankly. And while we're talking about it, I would even take the stance of pushing south and doing the same thing with Mexico,
Mm-hmm.
and coming into some kind of economic alliance with Mexico
Mm-hmm.
to benefit them and benefit. I would just like to see the entire continent of North America pulled together in some cohesive fashion. It doesn't need to be under U.S. quote U.S. Politics or anything else. But I think from an economic standpoint, I think it benefits all of the people in North America.
Looking at this idea of Canada becoming part of the United States, we have to sort of flip it around and ask the question: why would Americans want Canada? Canada could be America's East Germany. We have a lot of problems. I mean, when Trump talks about fentanyl, he's not kidding. We have super labs for fentanyl that are really basically that are owned and operated by foreign gangs, Chinese gangs, East Indian gangs, Khalistani gangs. We have super labs in cities like Vancouver and Calgary and Toronto, and that have made Canada a net exporter of fentanyl into the United States. And the ties of organized crime lead directly to our national government. So when he talks about the threat of fentanyl and the fact that our governments are not taking any interest in securing our borders, he's not kidding about that. And then when he talks about Panama, people should understand America built the Panama Canal.
Right.
That many thousands of good American men died there from things like malaria. It was one of the great feats of human engineering and will to create the Panama Canal. America constructed over 130 military bases there to protect it. And then for some reason, nobody understands, the lately departed Jimmy Carter gave it back to Panama And then in
Yeah.
1996, Panama gave it to Hong Kong, and so now we know who owns Hong Kong, and who therefore
Yeah.
owns the Panama Canal. That Panama Canal is the rightful property of the United States. Nobody can make a persuasive argument to me that that isn't true. And so, like a lot of the things that Trump says and the left attacks, that he's an imperialist trying to take over. And
Well,
let's face it, if Trump wanted to take over Canada by force, that could happen in 5 minutes. Yeah. I mean, the soldiers would be coming through my door while I'm talking to you.
I think he would, I think he would rather float the idea, have the Canadians go scratch their head, just like Netanyahu scratched his head, and like he said during the press conference the other night, everybody's jaw hit the floor when Trump said, "We're going to take Gaza over."
He sure got some people worried about that.
Everybody went, "Huh?" And quite frankly, it makes sense.
Yeah.
It absolutely makes sense. And what surprised me, Leighton, was John Fetterman, who I thought initially was out there. I just didn't give him much credibility at all. He came out today and said, it makes a certain amount of sense to do that.
Wow.
And so you're sitting there going, John Fetterman, John Fetterman? And so I think part of it is Trump just getting people to talk about different ways to solve problems. He comes out and he floats this stuff out there. He's doing the same thing, or will be doing the same thing, I'm sure, with the Ukraine and Russia, about finally those guys picking up their toys and going home instead of trying to, kill each other off. It's amazing what he does. He did the same thing with Greenland. Did the absolute same thing with Greenland. And then all of a sudden, but Greenland? Why the hell would we want Greenland? Well, China's trying to take over the North Pole and do all of the stuff up there. Greenland makes sense. And everybody goes, I'll be damned. When they said that Trump is probably the most consequential president that we've seen, that I've been fortunate enough to see in my lifetime, I think they're absolutely right. And I don't know how he could overcome, because I just read a thing about was it Wilkinson, who's the energy prime minister or energy
minister? Yeah, he's part of Trudeau's cabinet.
Yeah, he was all in favor of, pulling together the energy stuff and everything else with the U.S. Now, I don't know if that probably puts him at odds with Trudeau, which it probably does. But there's probably a certain amount of the Canadian government that would welcome, some of this,
Well, certainly our government in Alberta is very, very much at the forefront. Our Premier, Danielle Smith, she went down to Mar-a-Lago before the inauguration. She attended. She was the only Canadian political leader who attended Donald Trump's inauguration. And and she understands very keenly these important energy relationships between Alberta and the United States. We want to get pipelines. We want to get things like Keystone XL going. And Donald Trump is in favor of that. One of the major impediments that we have in Canada to economic growth is that we have more restrictions on trade internally within Canada than we do have with the United States. In fact, just recently, the premier, who is the equivalent of a governor of the province of Quebec, once again said that he would not permit a pipeline. There's an Energy East project that would be massive and would bring oil from Alberta into the central part of the country, into Quebec, essentially. He's opposed to it without any explanation. And so, of course, Quebec uses a lot of oil, consumes a lot of oil, like as every industrialized nation in the world does. But they're buying oil from nations in Africa and the Middle East, and from the United States, rather than from another province in Canada. So we actually have more trading restrictions within Canada than we have internationally with the United States. And this is just, kind of the bureaucratic nightmare that Canada is living through right now. One of the things I'm hopeful is going to happen is that, the Trump effect, if you want to call it that,
Yeah.
will kind of break down a lot of those trade barriers. We're seeing this happen. Look at what's happening in Argentina, what Mr. Milei has done there in a very short period of time.
Absolutely.
And he's in lockstep with Trump now. He's pulled out of the World Health Organization.
Yep.
There are nations in Europe that are doing likewise. I heard Vladimir Putin, of course, we have to take with a grain of salt things that Mr. Putin says, but we know he's no fool. He's predicting that the European Union is going to fashion its policies to get into the slipstream of the United States and Donald Trump out of necessity.
Oh, yeah.
And so we're seeing already, just within a very short time frame, sort of this impact of MAGA, this, as I call it, I call it a global response to globalism. It's really just right now shaking those foundations. But I think we're going to see over the next 6 months to a year, we're going to see these topple. And it's going to be very, very fascinating to see how these economies and how these international relations change in order to get in line with the very clear expression, the new expression of American hegemony. My opinion, and I'm interested to get your take on this, MAGA is, of course, a phrase borrowed from Ronald Reagan. And
Right.
Reagan now is the stuff of legend. But what he's known best for, his lasting legacy, is that he won the Cold War because he took advantage of a moment in history when the Soviet Union was very vulnerable. And he basically used economic means to bring down the Soviet Union. I believe that Donald Trump understands very keenly, perhaps better than most do, that if we're not already in a Cold War with China, we're embarking on one. And by the same token, he sees the vulnerability of China. China has a massive trade deficit with the United States, hundreds of billions of dollars, in fact. And I think Donald Trump understands very keenly that the U.S. is in another Cold War with China, and I believe Donald Trump means to win that Cold War.
Well, I think he will, Leighton. My only concern is how far do you push the Chinese?
Yeah.
Right? Because I think, quite frankly, if you really pulled the covers back on Beijing, they're hurting.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of things that are not right in China. And my only concern would be, the same reason that Germany elected Hitler and the Second World War started was basically to drag them up from the pits of crappy economy and energize that industrial base. My only concern is you're walking a fine line with pushing China maybe too much into a corner without allowing them to save a certain amount of face. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I don't know, I don't know if that's a very, very good analysis, but I think you run the same risk with Iran and their nuclear program. Trump was very, very specific. It ain't happening, boys. You're not going there. Netanyahu was very specific. And almost to the point of we've got a bunker buster with your name on it right here. You just keep going down this road and you're going to get introduced to it. And I truly believe that that's going to happen. I think Iran is walking down that same road. And what puzzles me, and I'd like your thoughts on it. What puzzles me is the ideology is so strong that they would just burn everything to the ground instead of everybody being lifted up. Just like with the whole Gaza comment about rebuilding Gaza and basically turning it into the Riviera of the East. They'd rather it be a slum.
Yeah.
And I don't get it. I don't understand that kind of thinking. I just, because you can have both. You can have, I don't think anybody's saying we're going to take your ideology away or we're going to take your religion away from you. All we're trying to do is say, you're not going to get a nuke, so you can't drop it on somebody, So I don't know your thought, around that.
Well, there's a few moving parts in what you're saying. I think you're drilling down to something that is very, very important. And when you are talking about Iran and you're talking about Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis, You're talking about people who subscribe to a 7th century warlord culture. And when you look at what Donald Trump is doing right now and wrapped within MAGA, MAGA is not just a political slogan like it was from Ronald Reagan. It's a cultural movement. When you start rejecting things like diversity, inclusion, equity, when you start rejecting the idea that there are no fundamental differences between men and women, when you start rejecting the idea that all cultures are equal, when we know that they are not, when you start doing that, what you're really saying is that there is a value and an integrity to Western culture. And this is core to the MAGA movement. Donald Trump is very, very explicit and very, very consistent about this, about the America first, that on balance, America, the American empire, has been a net good to the world. You can't say that about Hamas. You cannot say that about Hezbollah. It's even difficult to say that about Islam, certainly radical Islam. And so there's a cultural conflict there that's maybe at the root of the military conflict. It certainly is for the terrorists who occupy those countries and control them presently.
Well, yeah, it's like any ideology, though. I think it's been mutated to serve the people behind it that are pushing it, because you can certainly look at Eastern philosophy and mathematics and all of the contributions they made to the world. It's just astounding. And I think, to your point, the whole MAGA thing is drifting itself back to the Christian Judeo ethic that this country was founded on, is kind of where everything's starting to shift back to again. Even today, Trump was making the comment, and I'm sure his brush with that bullet in Pennsylvania, but he was even making the comment today that, religion needs to step back forward, right? And because they've taken a back seat because of the whole cultural issue, they've been afraid to say anything. Unfortunately, some of our political laws and whatnot stop pastors from preaching politics from the pulpit and so on and so forth. I think it's just a really interesting time. And I think what we're witnessing, what you and I are going to get to witness, is going to be transformational. I think completely from, that's just like the USAID thing that popped up here in the last week. I did a show many, many, many months ago about that whole USAID and how it destroyed the garment industry in the United States because they pushed it offshore and all the other things. Well, now all of the rest of the bad laundry is coming out around all of it. And I think we're going to continue to see that. And I would hope, to what you said earlier, that the Trump effect starts to bleed into the Canadian politics, and they start to really start to examine things and go, well, wait a minute, we can have something much better than this knucklehead that we've got, right?
Yes, but we have to demand it. I mean, people demanded a leader like Donald Trump.
Yeah, we did.
He is the man of the moment, but it's more than just him. There's a whole team there. J.D. Vance is a president in waiting, a brilliant man who is capable of handling media like really very few people I've ever seen publicly. It's really scary what a deep thinker he is. I watched an interview recently where he was actually quoting the theology of Thomas Aquinas in the course of an interview. Really incredible, high-level thinker.
Well, who he reminds me of is William F. Buckley.
Yes, great analogy.
That's who he reminds me of.
Only a little more relatable than old Bill Buckley.
He's a little bit more. He's a little bit more down to earth.
Yes.
But what reminds me, and
both Yale men, by the way, both Yale. Men. Both of them were from Yale.
Yeah. And I watched the Gore
Vidal.
The debate between those two, and
that was just vicious at times.
Yeah, I was just sitting there thinking, here we had Kamala Harris, we had Joe Biden, Mike, and you had Buckley and Gore Vidal, and that were literally going at it, and both of them, either one of them, could basically tell you to die in so many words, and you'd have to sit there and think about what they just said to you.
Oh yeah. Very,
because
very
they had
sharp,
such a
yeah.
command of the language.
Mhm.
But I agree with you. I think J.D. Vance has that same level of expertise, but he has the ability to make it a lot more relatable than what Buckley would. Because you sit there and listen to Buckley, and what the hell did he say? So anyway.
Another person who appeared regularly on Bill Buckley's old program was Dr. Thomas Sowell, who's going to be 95 this year. He has to be the world's leading public intellectual. And I'm pleased for him. I was just writing about him because, of course, he's been on the cutting edge of so many of these things. I mean, he was talking about DEI and the dangers of it 30 years ago. He wrote a book in 1989 that could have been written yesterday. And so I feel very pleased for him that he's lived to see the day when this revival is happening in the United States. And I think those of us in the Western Hemisphere have to really hope and pray that it's going to have some longevity to it, because Western culture has been really the greatest force for good for civilization in human history. It's just a unique blend of all the best aspects of going back to, of course, the Bible, Greco-Roman, philosophy, the Enlightenment, all sprinkled together, and of course the new American iteration of it that really started with the Declaration of Independence, all the way through the 18th and 19th and 20th and now 21st centuries. It's been the greatest force for good in human history, and not so long ago we were all really afraid that we were going to lose it forever. It's very much under attack. And who's attacking it? Well, the usual suspects: radical Islam, China, right? China, bleeding all this, gender theory and all these things into the American conscience through universities. You were talking about USAID. I was shocked to see how much funding was coming out of USAID into Canadian universities. That was really shocking.
And I think I'll end with this, but the USAID, and I was telling somebody earlier today, the amount of irreparable harm that organization has done, not only in the trillions of dollars of money thrown offshore for somebody's particular thing, but I think the globalists right now, because that was their kitty, Biden missed payments of $236 billion last year. And the year before that, it was $247 billion. I mean, we're not talking about $247. We're talking about $247 billion. And if you just look over the last decade, you're in the trillions. And like I said, in 61, when I'm sure Kennedy didn't have the vision that it was going to turn into a Marxist communist agency within the U.S. government that had unlimited resources, i.e. the taxpayer money, to spread and spout their crap all over the world. That's just like the news media. They linked back the first Trump impeachment to being funded from USAID, for God's sake. USAID was not out drilling water wells in Africa to help people have drinkable water. They were spending millions of dollars on electric vehicles in Vietnam and on and on and on.
I think Nancy Mace was talking about them spending millions of dollars trying to figure out how to make animals perform surgeries on animals to make them transgender. Really, really, I mean, that's horrifying when you consider that America owes the Chinese about $1 trillion. I mean, what could have been done with that money rather than spend it on all these frivolous things that really have not improved the lives of anyone and really have caused a lot of damage, haven't they?
Well, the minister of Hungary came out and said he applauded the fact that they'd shut it down or gave it a 90-day pause. He thought it was great because of the disruptive value that it had. Who is Orbán?
Viktor Orbán, yes.
He said the same thing. Mm-hmm. It's across the board. And as you mentioned earlier, Argentina pulled out of the WHO. And you're seeing more and more people going, well, yeah, it doesn't make sense. Let's do that as well. And I just think, me personally, I find it fortunate that I'm living at a time that I get to witness this as opposed to witnessing, and I lived through the Carter years. I've lived through the Obama years, and I've gone through the Biden years. Thank God I didn't have to go through the Kamala Harris years.
Yeah.
But
you did sort of. You did sort of.
Well, yeah, that's true. Yeah. So where can people find your podcast?
Well, first of all, it's been a privilege being on your program, talking with you. Thank you so much for having me here. It's been a joy.
It's always a pleasure.
But the best place to find us is on our X page. In Canada, that's about the only thing that isn't heavily censored these days. That's at Grey Matter Convo. It's on our X page. And so all of our content is there. We have a lot of American content there, a lot of really great American writers and commentators and people like that on our show. And also, obviously, some Canadian content as well for people who are interested in that. And nowadays, that seems to be something that many American people are interested in. And, perhaps they should be. Just as Canadians should pay more attention to American things.
Yeah, I think to me, it's a perfect blend of the two countries, and I don't know where it's going to end up going, but to me, from an economic standpoint, from a social standpoint, I think we all would benefit from a much closer relationship than what the politicians would have.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I quite agree.
And I think that's where Trump's going. Trump, there's a lot of value add, if you will, that the Canadians have. And I think to a certain extent, maybe not some of the cultural crap, that we have some value add. But
no question.
I just think it makes sense, quite frankly.
I agree.
And it doesn't make sense, like you said earlier, that you've got all of these fentanyl labs just north of the border that, the Canadians should, the Mounties or whatever, they should be going in and shutting them down, just like we've got ICE doing stuff here.
Yeah. The mood in Canada right now, frankly, was probably something like the way the French felt when they saw the American tanks rolling through Italy and liberating Italy during World War II. We're just waiting for all this stuff. We're very envious right now, seeing all this great stuff happening in the United States, and we want a similar revival, if you will, for Canada. And we're really praying that it's going to happen. I happen to believe that Mr. Trump and his administration are committed to it. They obviously think it's important. Otherwise, they wouldn't be wasting all this time and energy.
No,
I shouldn't say wasting, expending all this time and energy on Canada.
Leighton, I don't think he would have even mentioned it. And along with Greenland, I don't even think, because he doesn't do things just for shits and giggles.
Yeah.
It's purposeful. So he brought it up for a reason.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And like you said, it may have been just to poke China in the eye, but I think it goes deeper than that. I think it goes much deeper than that. And I think, he's looking for an alliance, some form or fashion. How deep that goes, I don't know just yet. But, quite frankly, I think it would be terrific that we were all one big happy family, quite frankly.
I agree. And I think Mr. Trump knows that in order to be for that to happen, we have to get rid of one member of our family.
yeah, you gotta boot the weird uncle.
Yeah, kick him out. I think Mr. Holman said that actually.
Yeah, you gotta boot the weird uncle. Yeah, but you give him a few shekels and say adios, and that'll be the end of that.
Well,
so
hopefully we'll survive his ruthlessness on his way out the door.
Yeah, well, that's true. Leighton, it's been an absolute pleasure. We've been talking to Leighton Gray, who's the host of Gray Matter, the Gray Matter podcast. And like always, it's a fabulous conversation. And I look forward to, touching base with you again in the future to see how this thing starts to unfold. Yeah. And hopefully, knock on wood, it continues to head in the direction that we're looking for.
Well, I hope that all of your listeners and viewers in America will pray for us in Canada, that we will be liberated, because it feels like a very long, cold winter up here in Canada. But spring always comes, doesn't it? We just have to pray for it.
Yes, it does. So again, Leighton, thank you very much for spending some time with us.
Thanks. God bless.
Yeah. Take care.
Thank you for listening. If you would like to listen to more Clarity from Chaos shows on demand, go to clarityfromchaos.buzzsprout.com or send Dave an email at info@clarityfromchaos.com for information on previous shows. You can also listen to the show on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Twitter, or Google Podcast. Until next time, please remember, it's not about waiting for the storm to pass. It's about learning to dance in the rain. Be well, everyone.